Welcome to Equip, Build, and Mature. It's a beautiful day here on Crete. As I like to do on Saturdays, I want to do an overview of one of the books of the Bible. Today we're going to be looking at the letter to the Galatians. So as I like to do is ask 5 questions. And as always, the first question is, who wrote this document? Galatians has always been the least questioned letter regarding Paul being the author. Paul wrote to Jesus' congregations in southern Galatia. During Paul's first mission journey, Jesus started his church in Asia Minor using Paul's proclamation of God's truth. Paul's close connection to those disciples of Jesus explains the strong words that he used as he started this letter. Galatians shows Paul at his angriest. He's so frustrated. He risked losing the appreciation the disciples in the Galatian region had for him in order to make certain that they were on the path of truth and not led off into some deception. Paul wanted to emphasize the serious purpose of this letter. So he took the pen or the stylus from his scribe and wrote the end of the letter himself in very large letters. We see this in chapter 6, verse 11. So what time in history did this take place? Paul traveled for 18 months. Then he returned back to Antioch after his first mission journey. Paul received news that the congregations Jesus had planted in Galatia were following a false gospel. Judaizers were the problem. To become a covenant disciple of Jesus, they demanded that you must live under the law of Moses. Those Judaizers gained a great influence among the communities of faith in Galatia. Paul wrote this letter a few months before he met with the Jerusalem Council in AD 49. And that was when the apostles discussed this exact issue. You can read of this in Acts chapter 15, verses 1 through 30. So why is this letter to the Galatians so important? Well, Paul wrote this very wise and clear letter before the Jerusalem Council. This dispute that he was discovering among the disciples in Galatia threatened the spiritual health of Jesus' church in the very early years of its development. The issue was defining the relationship between Jewish disciples of Jesus and Gentile disciples of Jesus. Paul was very aggressive because the issue was crucial to the survival of Jesus' church. The people had to embrace unity that can only be found in Jesus. If our unity is based on anything else, it will not last and it does not please God. Unity could not exist with racial distinctions. And this was a major issue for the Apostle Paul. Jesus' disciples in Galatia were abandoning Jesus. They were turning from the truth of God to a gospel that Paul had not given to them, and what he taught them he had been given by God. We see this in Galatians chapter 1, verses 6 to 9. So what is the major emphasis, the big idea of this letter to the Galatians? Jesus' covenant disciples in Galatia quickly fell away from the gospel of grace that Paul had proclaimed to them from the beginning. Also, they no longer respected Paul's authority as an apostle of Jesus. This is why Paul began the letter to these Galatians by spending 2 chapters speaking of those exact issues. Finally, in chapter 3, he got to the heart of their sin. The Galatians tried to be justified by keeping parts of the law of Moses. But Paul explained to them, humans can only be justified by having faith in Jesus' offered grace, not by trying to keep the law, not by trying to be legalists. Part of the problem that confronted the disciples of Jesus in the region of Galatia was an argument made by the Judaizers. Those false teachers said living by grace and living in freedom meant you were lawless and meant that you were living an immoral life. So in the final chapters of the letter, Paul clarified that being justified, an act of grace through faith, did not lead to a sinful way of life. Jesus' covenant disciples were freed from slavery to the sinful nature. Jesus and the Holy Spirit have now opened up a path of sanctified or holy living for us. So how does this letter and the truths and principles there, how does that apply to you and me in the 21st century? Unfortunately, the same exact type of false teaching that the Judaizers used to deceive Jesus' disciples in the region of Galatia, that type of teaching continues to be used today to deceive naive, new, or weak disciples of Jesus. We live with a tension. On one hand, we do not want to fall into the legalism that the Galatians were struggling with. On the other hand, we cannot live as if anything goes. The disciples' commitment to Jesus is based on the free gift of grace through faith. But as Paul thought, and as he taught at the end of Galatians, grace also results in a life of walking according to the Spirit. Is the fruit of the Spirit evident in your life? Or do you find yourself living according to the flesh or the impulses of selfishness, as he speaks of in Galatians 5:16-26? Way too often, we lose ourselves at the extremes of legalism and liberalism. We can surrender to a legalistic attempt to earn our salvation, to feel worthy of our salvation, or a who cares attitude about our sin, everyone's okay, it doesn't really matter. We need to learn, and I encourage you to learn from Paul's words to Jesus' covenant disciples in Galatia. Let Paul challenge you with God's words to pursue a holy life. Do not try to gain righteousness in your own strength. Being sanctified only comes as you and I understand the reality of God's powerful grace being acted in our lives as we strive with every effort to live for Him. Guys, thanks for sharing a few moments with me here today. Hope you have a great Saturday, and may God continue to bless us as we strive to find the middle. Not legalism, not liberalism, but truth. Have a good day. Take care.